Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we're going to explain why wages are falling. Okay, so one of the biggest problems with the economy in the last 20 years, especially the last 5 years, is that wages are falling. What do I mean with that? If you look at the actual nominal level of wages, basically they're stagnating. But if you look at what you can actually buy with your wage in terms of recently, especially food, energy, housing, especially compared to house prices, wages have really collapsed in the last 20 years. And I think most mainstream economists have very little interesting to say to explain why your wage has fallen so much in the last 20 years. They'll probably say things like productivity growth is not good, productivity is stagnant. And I think if you were to buy this argument, it wouldn't really explain why wages are aggressively falling, because productivity, as much as it's not growing aggressively in the last 20 years, it still goes up every year. And yet, if you look at what an ordinary person on an ordinary wage can buy, they're getting less housing, increasingly less ability to buy food, energy, the real basics of living. And especially if you look at their ability to buy assets, house prices, stock prices, wages are collapsing. Now, this is something which, it was actually one of the first things I ever started thinking about that got me into thinking about wealth inequality and the importance of wealth inequality. And the first thing I ever did after I quit banking in 2014 was I made a website. The website's still up. It was called wealtheconomics.org, but we've bought garyseconomics.org. So that website is still there. So basically, if you want to understand this theory of how wealth inequality affects wages and drives your wage down, if you want it in words, it's all there on the website, but we're going to explain it to you now. All right, so the first thing you need to understand is what is wealth inequality, because often when I talk about wealth inequality, people think I'm talking about income inequality. This is not about your job. This is about what you own. Before that, you need to understand what is wealth. So we've got a video on the channel called What is Wealth that really delves into this. It's one of the first videos we did, so a lot of new people might not have seen it. So if you want a really detailed explanation of what wealth is, go back and watch the What is Wealth video. You can see me walking around the canals around here. Basically, wealth is about ownership of assets. So the most obvious example for you, for most ordinary people, would be whether you own your own home or not. If you don't own your home, who does own your home? You need to account for your mortgage. So it's who owns the property after mortgages are accounted for. So if you own a 500 grand property with a 400 grand mortgage, you basically own only 20% of your own home. But what I want you to understand is wealth is not just housing. So for most ordinary people, owning the home you live in is very difficult. Most people are just trying to pay off the mortgage on their home, trying to own their own home. But there's a ton of other wealth that exists, which is mainly commercial property. So if you walk down the high street, you'll see shops, you'll see restaurants, you'll see bars. I'm talking to you from close to Canary Wharf, enormous office buildings. If you go into the centre of London, into Soho, you'll see theatres and shopping centres and all of these kinds of things. Who owns the commercial property? So residential property is still owned a lot by ordinary families, but commercial property is mainly owned through companies, through the stock market, and is overwhelmingly owned by richer people. I should also add, outside the cities, there's a ton of commercial wealth. We still do have some factories in this country. There's a ton of farmland. There's a ton of productive equipment. There's the windmills and the power plants that generate your electricity. All of this stuff is owned by somebody who owns it. Now, in this country, there still is a relatively large property-owning middle class. But in some other countries, almost all of the wealth is owned by the very rich. And if you were to go back and look at what this country was like 100 years ago or 150 years ago, very few people even owned the home that they live in. So basically, you can have a few different kinds of societies. You can have a society which has a large property-owning middle class, or you can have a very unequal society where almost everything is owned by the rich. I think the best way to understand how wealth inequality affects wages is to consider these two extremes. So let's consider first a relatively wealth equal economy where most people own a decent chunk of the wealth. So what that looks like is most people own their own home, but on top of owning their own home, they also own a big chunk of the stock market. They don't have a lot of debt, maybe they don't even have any debt. So what that means is you don't have to worry about paying rent on the mortgage because you own the home you live in, and you also get this passive income because you own the stock market. Now let's consider a very wealth unequal economy. This looks like basically nobody owns their own home. Everything is owned by the very rich. You might also have some debt, which is owned to the very rich. So in this situation, the vast majority of people, they own nothing. They basically have to work to live. If you can't get a job, then you can't live in a home. You might not even be able to buy food for your family. You very, very much need to work to live. If you don't work, then you're going to die, basically. The flip side of that is that all of this wealth is now owned by a very small group of families, which means each individual family will have extremely high levels of wealth. The passive income still exists, but rather than going to every family, it's all going to Rishi Sunak's family, basically. This means that each one of these families will have extremely high levels of passive income. So Rishi Sunak, if we believe the Sunday Times, is worth £700 million. He'll be making about £30 to £40 million a year, not much less than £1 million a week passive income. So let's consider these two economies now, right? So in the first economy, the wealth equal economy, there's not a huge amount of pressure on the family because you own your home. I own this property that I live in. I don't need to pay mortgage, I don't need to pay rent. It's great, that makes life relatively relaxed. I also have a stocks and share portfolio, which means I have a passive income. Every family would be in this situation. So what that means is every family is relatively financially secure. They don't have to work that much. When I say that, I don't mean that these guys are just going to sort of laze around, but it means that if they want to take time off work, they can. So for example, if you have kids, you know, when I was young, my mum didn't work until I was 11 or 12, and then she only worked a few years because I've got a brother and a sister, and she was raising the kids, she was cooking the food, she was keeping the house, and I think a lot of people would like to do this, but they have a lot of pressure that they need to work, they need to make money. If you have a relatively wealth equal economy, people can do this. People can take time off when they have kids, or if they have a sort of family tragedy and they need to take time off for mental health reasons, or if they have some creative project they want to pursue to see if it works out, they can take time off for this. So in a relatively wealth equal world, people don't have to work every hour God sends because they have a little bit of money to fall back on, they don't need to pay the rent, they have a bit of passive income. So high levels of financial security, low levels of pressure to work extremely long hours. People can take time out of work at different periods in their life if they need to. Now we look at one other thing about the wealth equal economy is it's not just you that has this financial security, right? Everyone around you has this financial security as well. And everyone around you also has passive income to spend on top of their worked income. So what you have then is a large number of people, financially secure, low levels of financial pressure, can take time off work if they need to, and they have disposable income to spend. That means if you do want a job, there's a big customer base. Now let's consider the wealth unequal economy. So in this situation, 70, 80, 90% of people own nothing, they have no passive income, they don't own their home, they need to work. And say 10% or maybe even 5% or maybe even in an extreme case 1% of people are phenomenally wealthy. So here there's real desperation for work. So there'll be lots and lots of people trying to work. But yeah, the extra problem that you have is you have a small customer base because there's only 1% or 5% of people who are relatively rich, only 1% or 5% of people who can spend. So you have 90, 95% of people competing for the spending of this small group. Now, at this point, it's important to understand that there is a difference in the spending behaviors of ordinary people and of wealthier people. So most ordinary people, they die leaving very little inheritance. They spend almost all of the money that they make during their lifetime. What people tend to do is they work during their life, they accumulate money, they might even buy their own home, but they spend that money in their retirement. So by the time they have retired, they've spent most of their income on everything they bought during the course of their life, and everything they saved up goes on retirement, end of life care, things like this. What that means is ordinary people spend the vast majority of the money they make over the course of their lives. This is very different to the behavior of very rich people. Now, if you are very rich, I use him all the time as an example, Rishi Sunak will make close to £1 million of passive income every week. When you make these kinds of enormous passive incomes, it is basically impossible to spend even a relatively small percentage of your passive income. That means that even if Rishi Sunak never worked, and even if he spent £100,000 a week, he would still be spending a tiny percentage of his income and his wealth would be growing very quickly. The rest of his income is going on buying assets. So what you can see here is that there's a very different behavior towards income and assets between ordinary people and rich people. Ordinary people accumulate assets during their life and then sell them back during their old age. Rich people spend a very small percentage of their income and just accumulate more and more assets over time. So at this point, you should probably be starting to understand why it is that wealth unequal economies have very low wages. In an equal economy, lots of people, financially secure, not everybody needs to work, they can take time out of work if they want to, lots of spenders, very high economic demand for goods and services and workers. In the unequal economy, huge number of people absolutely desperate to work, need to work or they'll die, small number of people who basically don't want to spend much money. The last thing to add to this is, in a modern, developed, high technology society, a lot of what the rich people own is very, very productive machinery, very high productive, what economists would call capital. You know, we're talking a lot nowadays about AI and how this is going to make it much easier to run a business with fewer employees. What rich people have in a high-tech economy is enormous amounts of high production, very productive machinery, equipment, which means that they can get a lot of stuff produced with a very small number of workers. So what you have in this unequal economy is an economy with a huge amount of people desperate to work for a tiny number of people who spend a very low percentage of their income and don't need any workers. This is basically a recipe for a disaster of low wages. And I think if you look both across the world we live in now, but also across history, you will see that anytime we have created an economy that has extremely high levels of wealth inequality, almost all the time we have had very low wages as an outcome. There are a couple of exceptions here, which is perhaps early USA, although it is becoming, I think, lower wages for your average person. Sort of late industrial revolution in the UK, and maybe I'll do a video at some point explaining these examples. But the general case is, most of history, most of the world today, including, I would add, this country 100 years ago, very high levels of inequality lead to very low levels of wages. And when you have high levels of wealth equality, better wealth distribution, like we've had in, for example, Europe in the 70 years after World War II, then you get high levels of wages. Okay, so that is the situation. Good distribution of wealth, high wages. Bad distribution of wealth, low wages. One thing that I think obfuscates this, makes it a little bit harder to see, is that especially in the last 20 years, we have seen this increase in wealth inequality, especially here in the UK, but also in a lot of countries. And we have also seen that decrease in wages. It can become harder to see because it's happened at the same time as a broad devaluation of money. Now, this is an important concept to understand, and if you want a full explanation of it, we have a video on the channel called Devaluation of Money. You can go and watch that, but I'll explain very quickly now. In the last 20 years, 25 years, we've had a lot of inflation, especially if you look at asset prices. This, to me, is largely because governments and central banks have devalued, reduced the value of the currency. They've done that by printing a lot of money. They've done that by giving out a lot of money. You can look at our early videos on COVID. The government gave out an enormous amount of money. When the government gives out money, it devalues money, and what you see is prices going up. What this means is we've got two things going on at the same time. Number one, inequality is increasing. When inequality is increasing, wages fall, but also prices of goods and services fall because there's very low consumption power in the economy. The flip side is the rich have this enormous amount of passive income that they're using to buy assets. So an unequal economy wants assets, it doesn't want wages. So what you will see when inequality is increasing is asset prices rising quickly, all assets, housing, but also stocks, gold, farmland, natural resources, and wages falling. But if you devalue the currency, what you can do is you can push all prices up. If the value of money goes down, what you see is all prices going up. So in assets, these two forces push in the same direction. Increased inequality means asset prices going up. Devalued currency means asset prices going up. So you see asset prices going through the moon. And in the last 20, 30 years, we really have seen that in basically all assets. But when we look at wages, these two forces are pushing in opposite directions. Increased inequality is pushing wages down, but a devaluation of the currency is pushing wages up, which means the two things balance out. And that means that instead of seeing wages falling, what you see is wages kind of flatlining, while the prices of everything else go through the roof, such as house prices, stock prices, food prices, energy prices, natural resource prices. And this really changes the way that ordinary people perceive what is happening. So if you didn't have that devaluation of currency, people would be able to see, damn, my wage is falling. Why is my wage falling? And we might be able to have a discussion about, well, this is happening because of rising inequality. But because of currency devaluing, people see their wages flatlining and asset prices going through the roof. This kind of disguises a wage collapse as a house price bubble. And a lot of people perceive house prices and stock prices going up as a sign of a good economy. So because of this devaluation of currency, what we have had is a collapse in wages, which I think can be seen in fall of living standards, and in my opinion is caused by increased inequality, kind of disguised as a house price and stock market boom. So you're disguising an economic depression in a sense as a strong economy, as a booming economy. Okay, so what's the conclusion? If wealth inequality increases, your wages fall, what you see is falling living standards, but you might perceive it as inflation, prices rising higher than your wages. Wealth inequality has increased massively in the last 5 years. That's why your wages have fallen. That's why your living standards have fallen. It's important to recognise that once this happens, your wages fall and asset prices go up, then that tilts the balance of power even further away from you and towards the rich. Because now these guys have assets which are more valuable and you have wages which are lower. So there's a really dangerous cyclical nature to this, which means that once inequality gets bad, wages fall and inequality gets worse. This is what I'm really worried about. This is why I started this channel. This is what we're trying to stop. There's another couple of aspects to this rising inequality which I think are worth noting, which is number one, it changes the kinds of goods and services that are demanded in an economy. So when you have a broadly equal economy, everyone is a consumer and economies will tend to produce things for ordinary people because everyone has money in their pocket. So you might produce sort of cars for regular people, good quality clothing and houses for regular people. But when the economy shifts towards a very unequal economy, you will start to see the economy move into the production of luxury things and basically very low quality things for ordinary people. So you will see that economies start to focus on the sectors which serve very wealthy people, such as luxury sectors, such as financial services. On top of that concentration in specific sectors of the economy, you'll also see geographic concentration, which we spoke about a few weeks ago on the Shape of Great Britain video, which is that since there's a large number of people desperate to work and a very small number of customers, people will be forced to move geographically close to the small number of rich people, which is why you will see in this country, we've seen a similar thing in a lot of countries, poor people flooding out of the countryside, flooding out of small cities into big cities. That means big cities become increasingly very crowded. That means rents become higher. And this just makes the situation worse, basically. Now you have low wages, high rents, people living in crowded, polluted big cities. And basically, it's a disaster. This was the economic dynamic which I recognized back in 2011, 2012, which is how I was able to recognize that the economy would keep getting worse. It was how I was able to make a lot of money as a trader. And it's still in place now. I think if you get the time, it's worth going back and looking at the website I put up in 2014, it's 10 years ago now, saying that living standards would collapse, saying that asset prices would go through the moon, because it was true then and it's even truer now. It's even truer now. I think the key message that I want to get down here is that wanting to reduce wealth inequality, it's not about the politics of envy. It's not even about fairness. The reason I do this, the reason I campaign to stop inequality from increasing, is because I do not want the ordinary people of this country, of other countries all over the world, to fall into desperate and abject poverty. That is what is happening. It is happening now in this country, and we get watched all over the world. People send messages all the time. It's happening here in America, it's happening here in Australia, it's happening here in Ireland, it's happening all over Europe. When wealth inequality is high, wages and living standards are low. Wealth inequality is increasing very quickly, living standards are decreasing very quickly. We are at present doing nothing to stop that, and wealth inequality will continue to increase very quickly, which means your living standards will continue to decrease very quickly. If we do not deal with growing wealth inequality, your kids and your grandkids' lives will be desperately, horribly poor. I'm not just saying that, I'm betting on that. I've been betting on it for 13 years now. I've made a lot of money doing it. I don't want it to happen. We can stop it. The only way to stop it is to change the tax system. We currently have a tax system which charges you and ordinary working people like you 30, 40, 50% and charges billionaires nothing. If we don't fix that, the problem gets worse, your life gets worse, your kids' lives gets worse. We need to deal with it. And the only way to deal with it is to get together and push back, educate your friends and your family that the problem is wealth inequality and the problem is getting worse. The politicians themselves are very wealthy, they're not going to fix it. I want to make them take action. I need you to help me. Support the channel, share the videos, understand what's happening and push back. Thank you.